Good afternoon, folks. Jimmy Bashar here with the ISO Stakeholder Engagement Group. First and foremost, thank you for joining us today to discuss the Demand Response Baseline Enhancement 2021 Track Update. We are excited for today's discussion. Before I hand it off here shortly to our VP, Anna Mckenna, we'll be providing some additional background for today's discussion. I'll flip over to the agenda slide so you can see. Followed by presentations from OwnConnect and Recurve, whom we once more thank very much for their time and collaboration in working with us over the analysis for this effort. And as a reminder, this call is being recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. And the recordings will be available on the webpage with all the other meeting material for a limited time following the meeting. And in addition, we'll be pausing for questions throughout. As most are familiar with this interface, we have virtual raise hand icons, which we ask that you please utilize to enter the question queue. And we'll be fielding verbal questions first, followed by any written chat questions that we see come through. And given the time, we'll be fielding questions after OwnConnect presents its portion, and during the Recurve portion, we'll be fielding questions sort of throughout, given that it is sort of a lengthier discussion. And with that, I'm happy to introduce our Vice President of Market Policy and Performance, Anna Mckenna.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's stakeholder meeting on demand response baseline enhancements efforts that we've been undertaking here at the ISO. I wanted to say special thank you to our panelists and to Recurve for their efforts in preparing this report, as well as to OwnConnect, who's here today to present their perspective as well. So thank you all for participating in today's meeting and all of you for coming. You know, earlier this year, when we heard some concerns regarding the ISO's methodologies for measuring supply side demand response performance, we commissioned this report with Recurve so that we could analyze and identify a test option for measuring demand response impacts on the grid operations from a reliability perspective, and particularly during those extreme stress conditions on the power system. We asked Recurve to test and refine open source comparison group methods that they had been using to evaluate demand response impacts. And the report that we'll be discussing with you here today explores ways to further the methodology for correctly assigning real-time performance values. You know, based on these findings in the report, we were able to confirm that the flex feeder methodology is a tariff compliant option that can be used by demand response providers. And the report also does provide some recommendations for strengthening our control group business practices, which we'll be looking to. The report does provide detailed information, and I believe you will have an opportunity to ask questions today on the methodologies used, and I encourage a good dialogue in today's meeting. From the ISO's perspective, you know, we do want to ensure that demand response transactions are settled reliably, transparently, and this methodology does provide us an option for, and demand response providers an option for doing so under our current tariff rules and consistent with our current tariff rules. At the ISO, we do remain committed, not just with this effort, but in other areas as well, to continue to find ways to overcome barriers to data access and handling that enable development of quality comparison groups. And that's if they're found to be the preferred ways of doing business in this area. We are very happy that we had this opportunity to test this particular methodology and look forward to more discussion. And we also look forward to working more with the state agencies and stakeholders in considering ways of measuring performance in a clear and transparent manner, not just for purposes and use in our own tariff, but across the board, across all the programs, to further enhance the ability for us to use demand response as part of our efforts to continue pursuing our clean energy goals. So thank you, everybody, for coming today. Look forward to the discussion. And with that, I will pass it on to Jimmy.
guess you're passing on to me, Anna. So this is Jill.
Go ahead.
Jill Powers. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for those introductory remarks. And yes, welcome everybody to our update on some of the activities that we've undertaken for demand response and these baseline enhancements over this summer. In fact, we had a customer partnership group meeting back in April 22nd, where we did review the specific enhancements that we are going to take a look at, some activities that we were going to take a look at. So we can move on to the next slide. Jimmy, I'll give a little bit of that background for those that maybe had not attended or were not following some of this activity. As Anna had mentioned, we did hear from our demand response providers a concern over demand response performance measurements undervaluing their actual performance, specifically in response to our January 2021 joint report on the mid-August 2020 extreme heat events, which did include resource performance information. So based on what was seen there was discussion with our demand response providers. They were concerned about the baseline methods, and the baseline methods, particularly in this case showing some underperformance or undervaluing the performance of their resources that had been dispatched during those periods of time. And in that conversation, they expressed, the effect that had, not just on energy compensation, but in other areas where performance measurements are used, such as at the CPUC for QC valuation, and with the utilities under DR contracts and the evaluation of those DRAM contracts. And when we did take a look at the historic intraday 2020 load on the system and the individual DRP load trends, there was evidence that some of the DR performance values, demand response performance values, may have been limited by the baselines and specifically some of the baseline characteristics. So in response, the ISO proposed some baseline enhancements options, some areas that we wanted to examine and kind of look at the impacts of these different tracks that we wanted to explore. And the first track that we identified was this study, the study of the comparison methodology that Recurve employs. So track one was this Recurve comparison methodology. The second track was approving the use of load adjustment factors that are used in our day matching and weather matching baselines. Use those adjustment factors outside of the minimum maximum caps, specifically for summer of 2021. So today we have both Recurve and we have a market participant, demand response market participant, Mckenna here to speak to both of these and update us on what has transpired since we took on this effort in early summer. Yeah, we move on to the next slide. So just as an update on the track one, we've completed the study on the viability of assessing a control group by all demand response providers and the use of the Recurve comparison methodology. Recurve in this study took a look at the comparison group methods in relation to our control group methodology, the FERC-approved control group methodology that we had in place, and they found it compliant. They also were able to provide some improved methodology specifications that we could consider to actually enhance our control group method. These did not require any changes to our tariff, but we can take these improvements into consideration and make those changes within our business practice manuals. Additionally, the Recurve study demonstrated the use of differential privacy for use in establishing a comparison group method and Recurve will be going into detail on that as they walk through the report. And they produced a report studying the 2020 summer high heat events utilizing this comparison group method across multiple demand response providers and in multiple service territories. And we thank those demand response providers that did participate in the study, did provide data to these efforts, and are reviewing the results of the study at this point in time. I did want to point out, and again, Recurve will get into some more detail, Recurve was unable to directly contrast this comparison method values that were studied and then the results of the study against the actual ISO settlement of resource performance to dispatch. So while we may have thought and kind of were thinking that we would do this really comparison across these two different methodologies, it was something that we were unable to do that direct comparison, and I believe Recurve will address that as they walk through the study results. Secondly, if we move on to the next slide, just wanted to give you an update on this track 2, some background. Last year, we set out to allow the use of this alternate load cap adjustment and use of it being uncapped for the summer of 2021, beginning in May and running through October. And we did have 4 of our demand response providers applied and were approved for its use. Just as a note, we have a couple different, and both of these, all of the DRPs were utilizing a day matching baseline. These current adjustment caps for the 10 and 10 day matching was 120% and 80% the minimum, as well as the 5 and 10 had the 140% cap with the 71% minimum. So for this effort, these DRPs were allowed to use, if necessary, load cap adjustments that went outside those caps. We did find the 4 demand response providers were utilizing this for both PDR, proxy demand resources, and reliability demand response resources. They were using those day matching baselines, and they were using them, the 10 and 10, the 5 and 10, as well as some day matching combined methods. In our review of the load trends over this past summer, the historic loads used in baselines, it looked like they were trending to exceed, in some cases, intraday load by more than the adjustment caps. In particular, July 9th was one of those dates that appeared to have trends that looked to be moving to exceed those caps. So this is somewhat of an evidence that the alternate LCA's load cap adjustments could have helped. Now, we did see these load trending higher in August than in July. We haven't received all of the settlement information, the performance information for August. So really, from an ISO perspective, we've only been able to look at what was happening in July. We do think that August will see some additional trending that makes it look like this alternate option may have helped. And I think that's it for my background information, unless do I have one more slide? Let's move on. Next slide, Jimmy. Okay, so that's it for me. And at this point, having just given you a brief background of the effort that we undertook over this summer, I am going to hand it off to John Anderson from Mckenna, who is the Director of Energy Markets, and he's going to speak to these load adjustment factors, their use of it over the summer months. So I will hand it off to John.
Jill, appreciate the introduction and the setup. I think you explain the context very nicely. And what I plan to do today is just share a little bit about Mckenna's experience using this process during the summer of 2021. So as Jill explained, this was really set in motion by the heat events that we saw during the summer of 2020, after which Mckenna and some of the other DRPs informed the ISO that our proxy demand resource performance, the so-called demand response measurement RAM, was in our case frequently and significantly constrained by the 140% upper bound on SDA. Are folks having a hard time hearing me? I'm seeing some messages come through.
Hey, John. Yeah, I'm getting, you are cutting out a bit. Yeah, mine, even though you were sounding fine earlier, so I'm not sure what happened.
Is that any better, Jimmy?
Oh, that's much better. Yeah.
Okay. I apologize for that. Just change my headset and we'll see if this works a little bit better. So what we found last year, again, as a residential demand response provider, using the 5 and 10 baseline methodology with our proxy demand resources, is that due to the extreme weather we saw in 2020, very frequently it was the case that our DREM was constrained by the upper bound, in particular on the same day adjustment, or the load cap adjustment, as Jill called it in her slides. And our concerns with this were really threefold, and all things that Jill touched upon in her presentation. One, we were concerned about the optics of this. We were concerned that our measured performance, given the 140% upper bound, would give the impression that PDR performance was much poorer than was actually the case. The PDRs were not showing up and were not heeding the call during these periods of extreme weather in California. And we saw some of this in the preliminary CAISO root cause analysis that came out last year. And it wasn't until the final report was published that there was some acknowledgement that explained the role that the SDA cap issue might be playing in the metered demand response performance. Number two is that for PDRs that were participating in the CPUC's demand response auction mechanism pilot, their performance and their payment, according to their contractual terms, was determined by the amount of energy that was settled in the CAISO market. And so if the settled energy quantity was being underestimated or undercalculated due to this SDA cap being binding, that would have implications for the fulfillment of those contracts and what proportion of the contracted capacity was deemed delivered. Finally, of course, if performance is being measured less than what is actually delivered to the market, that has settlement implications with CAISO. And so we were concerned, among other things, that perhaps we weren't being paid the full amount that we thought we were due for the energy that was, in fact, delivered to the market. And so we and other stakeholders consulted with ISO staff and talked about these concerns and potential solutions. And what that resulted in was a waiver process that was approved earlier this year that allowed DRPs to elect to relax both the upper and the lower bounds on the SDA for the period of May through October of 2021. And Mckenna requested this waiver for its entire fleet of PDRs in the market. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about how that impacted our performance. So the metrics that I've presented here compare outcomes from the summer of 2020, when the waiver was not in effect, and when the SDA was capped above at 140% and capped below at 71%, versus the summer of 2021, in which there was not a cap in effect, either at the upper or the lower end. And incidentally, for anyone who's wondering where the number 71 comes from, it seems rather arbitrary. It's just the reciprocal of the 140%, 100 divided by 140. So last summer, in the summer of 2020, when the waiver was not in effect, Mckenna, in 22% of its PDR dispatch hours during the summer months, had a calculated SDA that in fact exceeded 140%. So we were constrained to reduce that to the 140% cap in 22% of our dispatch intervals last summer. Had we instead been allowed to use an unconstrained SDA during these particular intervals, by our calculations, that would have resulted in PDR performance, DRAM that is, 169% greater than what was actually deemed delivered to CAISO and settled in the market. At the other end, at the lower end of the SDA cap, there would have been 2% of our dispatch intervals in which we were binding at the 71%, and had the waiver been in effect last year, we actually would have been deemed to have delivered less energy because we would have applied an SDA less than 71%. And in those instances, those 2% of intervals, our calculated performance actually would have been 50% lower. So with the good comes the bad. That was the deal that we struck as a set of stakeholders. If we're going to take the waiver at the upper bound, we need to take it at the bottom bound as well. So that was summer 2020. Fast forward to this year, summer 2021, we actually had far fewer dispatch hours in which the constraint would have been binding had it not been waived in the summer months. So only 5% of our dispatch hours had a calculated SDA that was in excess of the standard 140% cap. However, it still resulted in a significant, almost doubling increase to our performance during these 5% of intervals in which the cap would have been binding at the 140%. So while the waiver essentially was effective, if you will, in a far fewer set of intervals than was the case last summer, it still had a very meaningful impact on our measured performance and ultimately our settlement. Interestingly, the waiver actually resulted in us applying an SDA below 71% much more often in 2021 than it did in 2020. 5% of dispatch intervals this summer versus only 2% last summer. And the effect on our performance, a decrease in that case of about 59%, was generally comparable to what we saw last year. So jumping to the final slide, Jimmy. The outcome that you saw there, in particular, the difference between the number of intervals in which the waiver was effective between 2020 and 2021, is really not terribly surprising, in my opinion, when you think about the weather outcomes across those 2 years. We had less extreme heat events during the summer of 2021 than was the case last year. And so it shouldn't be surprising that for the waiver, the SDA cap applicable to Mckenna's fleet of PDRs would have been binding at 140% less often in 2021 than was the case last year. Nevertheless, we're very grateful and appreciative of the flexibility that was afforded to us by this waiver. As I showed, even with the fewer instances in which it was applicable during the summer of 2021, it still had a significant impact on our performance and our settlement in the market. I want to commend the CAISO for standing up this process, but also making the process by which DRPs could request and get approved for the waiver very simple, very transparent, and very well managed. I'll also mention that the work it took on the DRP side or the scheduling coordinator side in order to undertake the amended calculations and submit the data to the ISO was fairly straightforward. So this was, in my opinion, not a terribly heavy lift for the ISO DRPs or the SCs to implement promptly in time for the summer of 2021. And we would therefore recommend preserving the SDA cap waiver as an option for the summer of 2022, while ISO staff and stakeholders continue to explore baseline methodologies that account for the effects of extreme weather on residential PDR performance. We know that Recurve has been working hard in that effort, and we look forward to the findings that they intend to share today. But we encourage, again, the ISO to maintain this option alongside other options while these things remain a work in progress. So thank you again, Jill and staff, for giving us an opportunity to share our experience. I'll be happy to take any questions there may be before we move on to the next topic in this session.
Thanks a lot, John. And thanks again, Anna and Jill. Folks, as a reminder, any questions, please raise the virtual hand icon. If you dial in separately by phone, however, you push #2 to enter the question queue. Thanks. I do see one question in the queue. Kiara, please feel free to manage and give you some time to open it up.
Hi, it's Jennifer Chamberlain. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Jennifer.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. wasn't sure. I've got 2 calls going on and lots of technology, so apologies. I don't have a question for John, but do want to share C-Power, working with our scheduling coordinator, also took advantage of this waiver over this summer. I didn't do quite the same analysis John did in this way, but found that it did result in what we thought of as much more accurate responses, especially during heat events where customers' loads were sometimes up in 2020 so high that even a full reduction in the commercial and industrial space was still having them above their baseline. This wasn't perfect, but did, significantly improve results, and I think more accurately portrayed what was happening. So I would like to echo John's recommendation on preserving the SDA cap waiver for 2022 as we continue exploring methodologies during extreme heat, and echo his thanks for allowing a pretty easy process to do that this summer. So wanted to do both of those things in this context. So thanks for giving me the chance.
Thanks a lot, Jennifer. Appreciate those comments, and again to John as well. I don't see any more questions in the queue, and I don't see anything in the chat. I'm going to do one last check with you, Kara, unless I'm missing anything.
There are no questions at this time.
Great. Well, thanks again, John. And that brings us to the next portion of the discussion with Recurve. And let me make sure that Adam has the presenting rights. So, Adam, let me know whenever you're ready, and I can hand it over to you.
Yeah, go right ahead.
All right.
Yeah, this is Jill. I just want to thank Jennifer for her comments, as well as John for providing that additional information. The ISO is taking into consideration, as mentioned, we don't have all of the data yet to do a full view of the use of this that waiver option, but we're taking a look at that, and we will be making some decisions on 2022 summer and its use, but appreciate the comments and recommendations. So with that, I turn over the discussion about the Recurve study. I wanted to introduce Adam Shear from Recurve. Adam is the VP of Customer Solutions, and he will be getting into some detail on this, as well as I won't get a chance to introduce her, but I believe Carmen Best, who is the VP of Policy and Emerging Markets, will also be joining in on the discussion. So Adam, go ahead,
Yeah,
take it away.
Thank you, Jill. Much appreciated, and thanks for hosting this event today. I think it's exciting to get to share some of these findings and these results. And also wanted to just say, if folks do have more questions for John later on, I think there will be some time for Q&A. So if you were just a little shy or whatever it may have been, couldn't get off the triple mute you might have been on, then we'll have time for that in a bit as well. So I want to start just by saying thank you to CAISO for reaching out to us and getting this study going. I think we were really excited by this, and for us, it represents kind of a new arena, that being demand response. And I also want to thank all of the demand response providers and the LSEs, the CCAs, and the IOUs that contributed data to this, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. And then finally, I just wanted to acknowledge the folks who really put in the hard work here that I'm putting my face on today, which is Joe Glass and Steve Sufian on our engineering team, who really were in the weeds of this project from day one. I just kind of get to come in and put the cherry on top. And then Carmen Best as well, who's been intimately involved in this whole process and working with CAISO and getting to understand the context of the work. So with that, I'll just get started and give a little history of kind of how Recurve has come to the table in this arena, because you may be aware, you may not be aware, Recurve hasn't traditionally been a demand response evaluator, but one of the things that we have done a lot of work on is energy efficiency. And when COVID hit back in early 2020, this really represented a crisis for energy efficiency programs. One of the things we have done a lot of over the years is measure the hourly impacts of energy efficiency programs. And when COVID came around, obviously it had a major impact on energy consumption, both in the commercial sector and in the residential sector. And the question was, how can we successfully differentiate the results of a program or the savings that were attributable to a program versus the energy impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic? And the graph on the slide is just showing an example of the degree to which COVID impacted energy consumption in the months that followed the lockdown in California. So this is MCE territory, and the predicted consumption in the absence of COVID for an average residential customer was shown in that dark blue line. And then the actual consumption during this time period was shown in the orange line. And the difference between the two is attributable to people's response to COVID. So you can see that there was a major impact in average customer consumption from COVID. I'm just showing the residential sector here, but also this impacted the commercial sector. And that impact varied throughout the course of a day. So the predominant impact was during the middle of the day. So we needed a way to account for COVID, remove those energy impacts from COVID, and do so on an hourly basis in order to continue to make accurate and reliable measurement of energy efficiency programs. So we partnered with the Department of Energy and MCE and a few other organizations to put together a set of methods for comparison group sampling that would successfully isolate and eliminate the impacts of COVID from the energy efficiency hourly measurements. And we published this study. It's publicly available in partnership with the DOE. And in this study, we detailed several different sampling strategies for comparison groups and tested whether or not those sampling strategies were successful in producing good matches to treatment groups, whether they be commercial or residential, and then studying the effect that studying their ability to account for COVID. So we really used the COVID pandemic itself as a basis for testing the success or failure of sampling strategies for comparison groups. And ultimately, we came forward with 3 sampling strategies. And the one we're going to talk about today that we're deploying in the demand response arena is the site-based matching. So I'll talk quite a bit more about site-based matching, just wanting to give a little bit of the history of where some of these methods originated. So these methods are publicly available and they're open source. The code is open source as well that performs the sampling for comparison groups. So we also had a partnership at the time with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and through that contract, we needed to actually come up with an example by which we were privacy protecting data, and we needed to do so with comparison groups. And so the partnership with NREL led us to a conversation with OhmConnect, where OhmConnect said, hey, we have this issue that we just talked about with Jill and John and others, that the performance impacts from the 2020 heat wave were underestimated by the existing methods at the time, with the same day adjustment being capped and all that kind of stuff. So OhmConnect said, hey, would you mind taking a look at one of our events that was in MCE territory on August 14th, 2020. And this really was a good example for us, a real world example where we could pilot the privacy protection of non-participant data through the NREL partnership and publish a report that detailed differential privacy and its application to energy data. So we focused on this event that we're all very familiar with now, that caused these rotating power outages and this heat wave of the August 14th, the week of August 14th. And we did so with MCE and OhmConnect data. And we published a report, and this report focused mainly on differential privacy with the demand response event from OhmConnect as the conduit to demonstrate how you could privacy protect non-participant data in order to formulate comparison groups and in order to achieve data sharing in a secure way. So I'll talk more about differential privacy as we go on. These are just what the results looked like, where we measured the impacts of the participating customers. We also measured an analogous set of energy savings impacts on an hourly basis for a comparison group, and then we adjusted the participating customer savings for the trends that were observed in the comparison group as well, in order to come up with final savings values that were attributable to the event. And like I said, the main thrust of this study was differential privacy and a demonstration of differential privacy. But CAISO came forward and said, hey, we saw that report and we're very interested in these methods because we have comparison group methods that are currently approved in our tariff, but they haven't typically been utilized. And we are also hearing that people are concerned that the existing baseline methods are not producing reliable results and that it's not accurate, and potentially have an underprediction of savings, as John just talked about. So they asked us, could you look into this? And one of the things that we talked about is that, well, the demand response comparison group methods are currently approved in the CAISO tariff. They're often considered a best practice. There was a baseline analytics working group, I think in 2017, that did some testing on comparison groups relative to other weather matching baselines or other types of 5x10, 10x10 baselines, and found that comparison groups were the least biased and were considered to be a best practice. And other evaluations in the demand response world over the course of the past few years have also noted the desire to be using comparison groups. But comparison groups have very rarely actually been utilized in practice in the measurement of demand response. There are a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is data access barriers. You need access to non-participant data, which demand response providers don't typically have on their own. And you really need a more refined and highly specified set of methods in order for people to understand how is this calculation going to be done. So the tariff that is in is approved by CAISO already it's somewhat, there's some information there, but it is fairly generic, and it really needs, in our opinion, much more specificity and standardization. So the key objectives of this study were, number one, to understand and actually operationalize the comparison group methods, and take a look at the existing tariff and understand if the methods were compliant with the existing tariff, or if we could refine the methods in such a way that they could be aligned with the existing tariff. So some of the methods that we'll be talking about today, we actually refined a bit and changed from the way we had been doing the initial set of measurements on the Mckenna August 14th event in order to make them compliant with the tariff. I don't want to get into all the details, but if folks have questions, I can talk a little bit about that. And then also an objective of the study was to identify data access barriers and identify pathways to overcome those barriers. Data is the currency of demand side management now. We really have to overcome data access barriers, not just for demand response, but for all sorts of applications if we want demand side programs in general to be utilized at scale in California. And then third, we wanted to take a look specifically at the 2020 heat storm events. And also, Jill mentioned earlier that in an ideal world, we would have been able to do, very apples to apples comparisons with the savings that we were observing with the comparison group methods that I'll be covering versus the other methods that had been applied. And we weren't able to do exactly that for a couple of reasons, mainly because we wanted this study to be anonymous in terms of the DRPs and the LSEs that were participating. And that was really a request of participants in this study. Nobody knew what results we were going to find and preferred to be anonymous, but wanted to support the methodological development. Secondly, we had a good amount of non-participant data that was provided, but we didn't get full coverage across the state of California. So we were able to basically assess savings for where we had that Venn diagram type of overlap between DRP data and LSE data. So we had a number of CCAs that participated and an IOU that participated. Then we wanted to understand the impacts of demand response events through these methods operationalized at scale. So it was very important to not just look at one or two events, but to look at a number of events across a number of different cases. And so ultimately, we reached out to a whole bunch of DRPs, a number of LSEs, and we said, would you be willing to participate in this study? And here's the purpose of it. And CAISO was involved, and we were thrilled with the response. And we really genuinely appreciate folks who took the time and the effort to donate data and support this study. The study would not have been possible without a number of participants on the data donor side. So we ultimately ended up with a half dozen DRPs and 7 or 8 load serving entities, CCAs, and an IOU that were willing to participate in the study and provide data. And we were able to get a big cross section of programs in this study. So we had both residential and non-residential participants. We had solar and non-solar customers. We were able to look at a variety of programs, everything from sort of lighter touch residential programs to load control programs on the commercial side amongst larger customers. And we covered a huge swath of the state of California. Of the 16 climate zones, we were able to study events that occurred in 11 of them, and many different sub-laps as well. I think that goes without saying. So I want to talk now about more of the methods themselves. Like, what are the methods? What did we develop? How do we test them? And so the methods, really, we're calling them flex meter, and that's just to provide a moniker that isn't like a 6-word phrase to say demand response comparison group methods all the time. We'll call these methods the flex meter methods, and they really consist of 4 distinct parts. So step 1 is you need to take your group of participating customers and match them to non-participating customers that are well representative. So you want to take every single treatment customer that participated, and ideally you would have a very good match to that customer that represents that customer, other than the fact that the matching customer in the comparison group did not participate in the program. So step 1 is formulating a comparison group match. There's a lot of work that goes into that I'll get into here in a minute. Step 2 is you then calculate savings for the treatment and the comparison group. You calculate the hourly load impacts on the event day. And step 3 then is to take the difference of differences. So comparison groups have been in practice in many different applications across the demand side world for a long time. This difference of differences term simply indicates that you're looking at the treatment group and you're looking at the difference between the consumption you predicted for the treatment group from your baseline and from the counterfactual that you project forward. And you look at the difference between that and how much they actually used. Then you do the very same thing for the comparison group that you had selected in step 1. And the difference between those differences is the savings that are attributable to a program. So if you have a group of participating customers that saved 10% during an event, and you see a group of non-participating customers that actually used 2% more, then you would give the 12% savings, the 10% plus the 2%, to the program as attributable to the program. That's the nature of the difference of differences calculation, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. And then finally, we are applying differential privacy, and this is a modern privacy method whereby we introduce some calibrated noise into the final statistics in order to mask the presence of any one individual in a data set. And this is a modern set of privacy methods that is utilized by Google, is utilized by Facebook, the US Census, and others to protect non-participant or to protect population data that they would want to release in order to provide social value. So all of the underlying methods that go into those 4 steps are open source, and they really begin with the CalTrack methods. The CalTrack methods were developed in a stakeholder process with PG&E and the CEC and the CPUC, I think dating back to 2017. And the CalTrack methods are an hourly set of methods that provide baselining and counterfactuals at an individual meter basis. And then the CalTrack methods are implemented through an open source code base called the OpenEE meter. And that's being managed by the Linux Foundation Energy at this point. So the Linux Foundation is the largest open source repository in the world. And the OpenEE meter, which runs the Caltrack methods, is housed by Linux Foundation. Then the Open Grid meter is the code base that is also open source that is used for comparison group sampling. So the individual site-based matching techniques that I'll be describing today are open source, and they're available through the grid meter. You can download the code on GitHub today and use it yourself if you would like. And then the energy differential privacy methods are pulled from a code base called EE Privacy, which is also open source. So if folks want a deeper dive on any of those methods, feel free to ask during the Q&A. But those are the underlying methods and where you can find them and find the open source code bases. We also, by the way, plan on releasing an open source sort of supplemental code base that kind of creates the connective tissue between some of those steps. So Caltrack, grid meter, differential privacy, those kinds of things to provide those connective tissue between the steps for the specific purpose of the demand response application. So how do comparison groups actually work? And I'll give just a really high level overview here, and I think I've already described it a bit, but I want to be clear on these things. So the first step is to measure the change in consumption for participating customers. So if we had a treatment group and we see that they have positive savings, this is what we're measuring, and we're looking at this difference is the difference between the predicted consumption from the model versus the observed consumption, the energy those customers actually used. So in this case, this schematic, we have positive savings from the treatment group. And then we also measure the change in consumption in an analogous fashion to the non-participating group or the comparison group. So in this case, we see that the treatment group saved some energy, the comparison group actually used a little bit more, and the savings are calculated as effectively the difference between these two. There's some subtlety to how this happens, but this is done at the end of the day on a normalized basis, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But this is the guts of the comparison group calculation, and this is how it's applied, generally speaking. So the first step toward actually making this kind of a calculation is selecting a comparison group. And the selection of the comparison group, the ultimate goal is to find non-participating customers who emulate the treatment group as well as you possibly can. So there are a few steps to site-based matching. The first step is for every single treatment customer, you need to find a comparison group customer or a number of comparison group customers that match based on sector, based on the LSE territory, based on the climate zone, and based on the solar status. So every single comparison group that we are formulating in this study, first and foremost, has to be matched to the treatment group based on these characteristics. So every treatment customer, if a treatment customer is residential in MCE territory, in climate zone 3, and is not a solar PV customer, those characteristics have to be shared with any comparison group customer that would be matched to that treatment customer. Then at that point, you have kind of that categorical matching. Then you can turn your attention to how well the load profiles match between respective treatment customers and potential comparison group customers. So as the basis for that load shape equivalence, we use average weekly load shape in the baseline period. The baseline period, just to get technical for a second here, is defined as the 45 days, the 45 non-event days that lead up to the event in question. So if we're talking about an event on August 14th, it's the 45 days before August 14th that were not event days for any particular customer. So then we use the average weekly load shape. And the reason we're using the average weekly load shape as the basis for comparison is that it gives you a good insight into not only hourly consumption, but it does so in a way that allows you to differentiate between weekdays and weekends. So many customers may share average daily load shapes that look very similar, but actually have weekday versus weekend usage patterns that are very different, and you don't want to get tripped up over that. So we use average weekly load shape. And then for every single participating customer, we take a look at every possible comparison group match. So every non-participating customer that's available for the comparison group. And the customer that is the best match, we do a sum of squares calculation across that average weekly load shape. The customer that is the best match is selected into the comparison group. And that process is done until you get a large enough comparison group we provide some recommendations about this in the report, but you don't want the comparison group itself to be introducing a lot of noise into the calculation. So you need a comparison group that is sufficiently large. So we do this as many times as is needed in order to get a large enough comparison group for the treatment group. And this is what that looks like in practice. So the top graph is showing the average weekday load shape, and the bottom graph is showing the average weekend load shape. And the three curves are the treatment group, which is in green. That's the average daily load shape of the treatment group. The average daily load shape of the comparison group that we've selected is shown in red. And the average daily load shape of the customers that were available to be selected into the comparison group were shown in orange, that orange dashed or dotted line. So effectively, if we were to just take a random sample of customers, we would wind up with the orange dotted line, which is clearly not a good match to the actual participating customers. So what we do on an individual customer basis is, through this matching, ultimately yields a much better load shape match, and it yields that categorical match that we talked about earlier. One important point I want to make is this is not just a fortuitous sort of averaging out of errors, but we actually see that the fact that we're doing individual site-based matching yields a good match across the entire range of customers that participated in the program. So here I'm just looking, I've separated out the treatment customers into quartiles, and I've ranked them by their min to max ratio and their average daily load shape, the minimum usage versus the maximum usage. And you can see that from customers in the lowest quartile shown in the top left, all the way through customers in the top quartile of that metric, we see that our comparison group selection has produced a very good load shape match. And I can look at any different kind of parameter and plot these out, and we consistently see very good load shape match across however you want to slice and dice the data. So this is a strength of these methods. So let's get into just an example of how this is done, and I think a lot of this will come together fairly intuitively. So first we take a look at the treatment group, and I'll just explain every element in this graph. So we're just looking at a daily load shape on an event day. And in this case, it's August 19th, and we're looking at one particular DRP in one particular LSE territory. And I'm just looking at the average daily load shape of a customer that participated in an event. That's the modeled prediction of consumption on this day is shown as the dashed blue line. Then the actual observed consumption is shown by the circles. In the event period, those circles are shaded, and you can clearly see that there was an impact of the event. Then the X's are the percent differences that we're observing between the predicted consumption and the observed consumption. So we see about a 30 to 40% drop. If we look at that first hour of the event, hour 17, we see about well, if I take those 2 hours together, I see a 28%, 29% drop in consumption. So in the absence of a comparison group, we would say, okay, we're measuring a 29% average load reduction during the 2 hour event period. So we make the exact same measurement for the comparison group that we had selected that I showed earlier. And we see in this case that there is a 5% increase in consumption during the event period that the model didn't predict. And so we take that 5% increase and we add it to that 29% decrease, and we wind up with an event period difference of differences of 34%. So we would say on average during this event period, obviously there's a difference between hour 17 and hour 18, but we would say that there's a 34% average event period load reduction. Then you take that percentage-based measurement and you bring it back and you multiply that by the actual consumption or the actual predicted consumption, and you wind up with a load impact for the event. In this case, the average event load impact is about 0.94 kW. So all of this can then be scaled to the number of participants that did participate in this event. So if there were 1,000 participants, you would just scale this accordingly. Then we can bring it all together, and this is kind of what that looks like. Every single component of that calculation, this is what that looks like all together. So you have the treatment customers, the observed versus the predicted. On top, you have the comparison customers, observed versus the predicted, the percent difference that we're measuring in each case, and then finally rolling it all into an absolute load measurement in that bottom plot for the average customer for this event, this August 19th event. One thing I have not mentioned is that the non-participating customer data, or any data that relies on non-participating customers, so the savings information that's been adjusted, for example, so the bottom plot here, as well as the middle plot, is protected with differential privacy. So in this case, we've added just a slight degree of noise, and you can see that indicated in the graph of each one of these counterfactual and observed meter readings. It has been obscured with a slight amount of noise that we have added to those statistics, and that noise is added to make it harder for a hypothetical attacker to determine whether or not any individual customer is present in that data set. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like if we were to really ratchet this up, this is that exact same set of data, just with differential privacy increased by an order of magnitude. So you can really see that the differential privacy, if it's taken too far, obscures the statistics that you need in order to make a valid measurement. So the approach that we took in this study was to maintain differential privacy at a level that did not obscure important statistics, but that added enough noise to provide an enhanced level of protection above and beyond the 15 by 15 or 15 by 100 rules that are typically utilized in order to enable data sharing. We're also adhering to those rules. We're just adding this extra level of privacy enhancement in order to be able to in order to safeguard these data better than the traditional rules would enable. So I want to mention just a few things that, by way of methodological strengths, that I think are important here. One aspect of the FlexMeter methods that I think are very, very important is you get a measurement of the total savings. So what are the total load impacts, the total energy consumption impacts of a program? And in many of the cases that we studied here, these demand response programs are actually having an overall energy reduction. They're causing an overall energy reduction, which is a good thing. So we're able to make that measurement very directly with the FlexMeter methods. It just comes out of the calculation. The second thing is we can directly monitor take back, or people may have heard of this as the rebound effect. So in the graph above, we're looking at, again, DRP-B. We just anonymized the DRPs and the LSEs. So this was DRP-B, LSE2. And we were able to measure the event savings, but we were also able to measure savings that occurred throughout the course of a day. So savings that were right before or right after the event period. That's this event plus or minus 1 hour. Event plus or minus 2 hours, so hours that were 2 hours on either side of the event. And we see some increased consumption in those hours, and that's indicative of a take-back effect. And then finally, hours that were well outside of the event. In this case, we saw very, very little difference beyond what we had predicted and what was adjusted by the comparison group. If we look at a different case, this is now a commercial program in the bottom plot, and the events tended to be much longer. So we're looking at event hour 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We see good persistence across the event, but we see that in this case, it's the opposite effect. In the hour leading up to the event, there was actually a high degree of savings. And it looks like the take back that occurred in this program was a little less severe maybe, but it occurred in the hours that were well outside the event. So this is just a programmatic thing. This program very likely managed customer load and had scheduling components that were involved to push load into the middle of the day or overnight. And we see very clear evidence of that here. And the program above is a residential program. And this is probably, a high degree of pre-cooling or cooking dinner ahead of time, those kinds of things. So, we see very, very different take back or rebound effect behavior depending on the program. And, this is just kind of highlighting what I just mentioned. You can see that in the savings plot here as well. This is the savings plot for this top graph. And you can see that in those hours right before and right after an event, the savings is, it's highly negative savings. It's increased consumption. I would just want to give an example of why take back is important, and it's important for the methods that one would choose to use for a demand response load impact calculation. This is an example of an event from DRPD now, LSE1. This is a commercial program. And when we take a look at the savings that we calculate with the comparison group adjustment, we see a high degree of increased consumption that occurs in the middle of the day, all the way from 7 a.m. through noon, or even into the event period where they had only partial participation during the events that were called in these kind of early afternoon hours. And if you're using these hours in order to make a same day adjustment, you are inherently building take back into the same day adjustment. In this case, that would cause inaccurate results in a savings calculation. So I think it's important that folks are aware of take back and the impact that it has. And I know that we're not the only ones to point out take back. Many evaluations, I'm sure, have looked at take back. But one of the advantages of the flex meter methods is you can get a very good degree of certainty about take back, and you're not building it into a baseline adjustment. So finally, I'll just cover a few summary results. We looked at a number of programs, and like I said earlier, all of this is detailed in the report. The methods themselves that I talked about are described in much greater detail in the report. But we looked at commercial programs, residential programs, and non-event hours, event hours. All of this stuff it provides a consistent basis for comparing programs. And that's one of the other advantages of the flex meter methods. One of the things we were curious about was, can you apply these methods equivalently to different kinds of programs? And the answer appears to be, we do get stable measurement across a wide variety of programs. One of the things I want to point out is that we provide a lot more summary results. This is just an example. We looked at 3 events, for example, for DRP B, LSE2. All of the individual events are covered in the report. So if folks want to read about any individual event or look at the results from any individual event, we document exactly how savings were calculated without a comparison group, the comparison group adjustment, and then the final adjusted savings value. So for this particular DRP on August 14th, we saw that the comparison group had some naturally occurring savings, or we observed that the model underpredicted or overpredicted consumption a bit. So we saw some quote unquote savings, and we needed to adjust for that, whether it be an exogenous effect or a model error, we needed to adjust for that. And at the end, we came up with an adjusted savings value that had been lowered a little bit by the comparison group. But on the 19th, we saw the opposite effect. So we saw that the model underpredicted usage for the comparison group, and therefore the unadjusted savings needed to be bumped up in order to find the result that's genuinely attributable to the program. So we provide this kind of breakdown for all of the events that we studied. And I just want to talk a little bit about, and I'm almost done here, the kind of importance of a comparison group in making these kinds of measurements. So in these histograms that you're looking at, the red histogram is during hours that were not in the event period, and these are unadjusted savings. These are just looking at the treatment group. And then the event period is shown in blue. And you really don't see much of a difference between these two histograms. But if I look at the hour that was right before an event, so the top histogram is looking at just event period versus non-event period, and the average of each of those time periods is about the same. So you would not say there's a lot of savings from that program. But when we look at hours that were, again, this is just the treatment group, 1 hour, the first hour of the event versus hours that were right before or right after an event, you can clearly see a difference between these two curves. Now, in this case, customers are using quite a bit more in the hour right before or right after an event. So it just kind of defies logic that you would have a set of customers that are not responding to an event during the event period, but somehow are using a lot more than they otherwise would have in the hour right before or right after an event. This kind of thing is exactly what you capture in a comparison group. And ultimately, we did measure significant positive savings for this event because of the comparison group. And we talk about this in the report just as an example. And this is what that event looked like. I want to draw attention to one last thing. If you look at the counterfactual, the blue dotted curve, this was our prediction of consumption. In the event period, you can see kind of a hitch, like a little bit of a dip there. That doesn't look, I've looked at a lot of load curves in my day. That doesn't look like a natural thing. And the reason that you see that is we did not have complete records on the event period data that occurred in the baseline period. I mentioned earlier that you need those records in order to black out those days. The reason you black out those days, and this is done in other methods as well, you don't want to build in demand response events into the baseline period because that's going to be captured by your model and will then show up in your prediction. And in this case, it will also show up in the comparison group selection. So you see a little bit of that hitch in the comparison group as well. And this is actually an indication that the comparison group selection is doing a darn good job, but you certainly don't want to capture that kind of event period data in the baseline unintentionally. So it's really, really important that we have a data specification that's very clear. And in this case, and frankly, for this DRP in general, we undercalculated savings because we didn't have a full accounting at the time that we made these measurements of the baseline period event data. So just a cautionary tale that you really need to have and follow a data specification. So we've, as part of this report, released a pretty detailed data specification that it applies to the meter data. It differentiates between LSEs, where you would be getting non-participant data, versus DRPs, where you get participant data. And it provides specifications for meter data and program data and event period data. All of that kind of stuff we've detailed as well as we can. If folks follow this data specification and do so accurately, then we have a very solid and sound set of methods that I think meet what folks have thought are best practices for a long time. They meet the CAISO tariff where it's at, and they are much more highly specified, and they hinge on open source code. So all of this can be applied consistently across demand side programs. At least that's been our observation. And one of the last things to really solve in being able to widely use comparison group methods is the issue of data access. So I want to invite Carmen Best to provide some comments on data access and some of the recommendations that we provided in the report associated with data access.
Sure, thanks, Adam. I was just going to provide kind of some highlights on that objective number 2 that we had for the report. It kind of comes as no surprise to folks listening in on this call that data access for third-party demand response in particular has presented some significant challenges for implementing DR, both for getting participant data, but clearly for getting non-participant data as well. And as Adam was describing on the measurement verification side of the fence, secure access to non-participant data means that some of the most reliable methods that are available for assessing demand response performance are effectively off limits to third-party providers. And I think that, as we noted, one of the objectives of this study was really to demonstrate how data could be securely used by an intermediary. In this case, it was Recurve, but there are other entities that could maintain that sort of security provision without being able to reveal personally identifiable information and there's an extremely low risk of re-identification within that non-participant pool because of the practices that Adam laid out for applying differential privacy, aggregation plus differential privacy, and the fact that this report is not a data set that's accessible, but rather it's archived in a report, and graphics is another way that it's very secure. So in particular for the non-participant pool, the DRPs and even the CAISO in this case never saw a whiff of the personally identifiable information, much less an opportunity to be able to reasonably unpack the re-identification of any individual within the data set. And this is a great example of how you can get really good public value out of this data without really sacrificing personal privacy at all. So as California continues to rely on demand-side resources to meet grid needs, it's imperative that market actors and the 3 state agencies continue to work together to break down some of the barriers to data access that inhibit consistent performance assessments. And as both Anna and Jill noted, this method is a very useful one in the assessment of performance. And if data access is one of the primary barriers to greater provision of it, then we should be putting our collective efforts into making sure that that data can be available and can be available securely. So that's really all I wanted to comment on that. As Adam noted, the establishing data pipelines and ensuring that the specifications are followed are that's a lesson learned from probably any evaluation that's ever been done, and would be particularly important if timelines and latency were such that we needed really quick turnarounds on results. So I wanted to reiterate a thank you to all the data donors that made this study possible, and I also look forward to working through these issues with any of the state agencies that are interested in thinking of ways that they can securely provide data, securely share data, or otherwise apply these methods in their situations.
Thanks, Carmen, and I think we're happy to take any questions.
And thanks again, Adam and Carmen. Very eloquently put for extremely technical analysis and issues, so appreciate all of that. I don't see any questions. Kiera, I'm not sure if you're noticing any, but folks, we do have plenty of time for open dialogue, and that was a lot of information. And so we do encourage comments at this time. We did set time aside at the end for additional questions, but we have now more than I think we expected. So definitely encourage questions. As a reminder, you can raise your hand virtually. If you dialed in separately, though, you need to push #2. As we're giving folks time for that, Adam, if you want to maybe give me the presenting rights back, I can relieve you of that. Thanks again.
Yeah.
I see a message or a question in the chat. Has there been any input from the California IOUs on their willingness to provide data for these purposes? We did have one IOU that did participate in this study. So it's, but most of the data was coming from CCAs that were participating.
Thanks a lot, Carmen.
Beyond that, we haven't gotten other input, I guess, is the answer to that question.
Thanks. And we are asking, or I should say requesting comments, or encouraging, rather, for anything to be referenced potentially, for future related discussions in the various forums wherever they may take place. But this is not a formal stakeholder process, so comments aren't required. But definitely encouraging them, and we did record this session as a reminder. You can look for that to be posted onto the meetings material, or I should say onto the webpage along with the other material in the next business day or two. And so with that, actually, I think we have questions coming in on the chat. Looks like we have one in the queue, Kira, if you want to maybe open it up.
Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, this is Chris Devin with Customized Energy Solutions. Can you hear me all right?
Hey, Chris, yeah.
Yeah, I was just curious about kind of the next steps in the process, and maybe I missed it earlier when Jill was going over this, but you know, what's the kind of major takeaways I should you know, be reporting out on this meeting, and are we going to have, you know, some additional analysis like what was presented by Recurve even further than what's been done? Are we going to, you know, be doing any type of additional waivers, kind of like what John was talking about from Mckenna earlier? Does the CAISO have any kind of messaging that you'd want to you know, have us do, maybe as like a high level takeaway from the call today? Because unfortunately, I think I may have missed some of that throughout the discussion today. Perhaps it was on my end, though. If anybody wants to take a stab at that, I'd appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, Jill, if you want to speak to it, I can speak to it at first, but if you want to elaborate. So these will be BPM changes ultimately once they do go into effect. We haven't seen any conflicts with the tariff that would prompt us to go through a formal stakeholder process. So this was intended more to be sort of a formal sort of courtesy of the effort that went into the analysis that will ultimately be brought through the BPM process. So I think that's all I have to.
Okay. That's helpful. Sorry. Go ahead, Jill.
Yeah, I think you did miss some of, you know, Anna's opening comments was really, you know, we pursued this to gain some insight onto the use of this particular methodology. The main thing that we did identify, it is compatible and in compliance with our current, we term it control group methodology, that is we have available to demand response providers in our tariff. But as mentioned, the Recurve did a bit more and kind of suggest some additional best practices that we will incorporate based on the analysis. As Jimmy mentioned, yes, this is not a formal stakeholdering process. We kind of went into this this past summer with FERC compliant, you know, identifying areas we thought that we would be FERC compliant, one being the load point adjustment, and put those processes into place to allow for that option, as well as now have identified that this option is available. I know it's a lot of information to digest at this point in time. It is informational, but we will be, next steps could be additional requests for, you know, more review. Since we now have the study out, the report is out, we're hoping that our participants will be diving into it and that they'll come up with some very detailed questions for the ISO or for Recurve to answer. I know it's kind of hard to do here, having just gone through the overview and not having a lot of time to digest the information that was provided in the report. But yeah, I mean, those are the main takeaways. It's available. They will remain available. The other thing I do want to mention, we have optionality in our tariff in terms of the type of performance methodologies. So those will remain. We're not currently considering any changes to those optionalities, but I think it behooves us to kind of look at this report and the study and determine, particularly on ways in which we might be able to standardize, particularly performance measurement for both, as we identified, the variety of different areas in which performance measurement is utilized across the agencies. So that's another further discussion kind of pathway to take.
Okay. Okay. You know, that is very helpful. I appreciate that takeaway, Jill and Jimmy. I think I may have just missed a bit of that initial intro from Anna on this, and there was a lot of information presented here, very helpful though, and so I thank you for that, and that does provide me a little bit better sense of exactly the next steps. Do you have any idea when you might be doing that BPM change related to this? Is it on the schedule yet?
We don't have it on a current schedule.
Okay, so it probably just take some more feedback, see where you guys go from there, and then
we'd like to receive we'd like to receive comments. We'd like to see if there's additional dialogue that our participants would like to have, and then take it from there. Next steps from there.
Very good, very good. That helps. Thank you so much. I'll let you go with that. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Good question, Chris, and thanks, Jill. And Luke Tugas had a similar question along those lines, asking when the recurve comparison approach would be available as standard feature. So yeah, more discussion to come, and we invite the collaborative effort on all of this. And I am seeing a question about whether there's a comments deadline. We can add a deadline. Again, this isn't a formal process, but usually 2 weeks from the discussion. I can clarify that on the meeting material. So good question as well. And just a final call. I don't see any further questions in the queue, so I just want to say a final thank you to Anna, Jill, and of course, John and Adam and Carmen today. Great discussion. Given the importance of VR, we're looking forward to working with you further on this effort, and we appreciate everyone's time. And you can look forward to the recording to be available soon on the webpage. So thank you again, folks. Have a great rest of your day.